It's late November of 1966, and two lake freighters, the Edward Y. Townsend and the Daniel J. Morrell, both over 60 years old, are docked in Buffalo, New York, which was supposed to be their last voyage of the season. But as fate would have it, another freighter was having engine troubles, so the two other ships were ordered to make one last trip on the Great Lakes to collect a load of iron ore from Taconite Harbor, Minnesota. The two ships left port just as a fierce November gale began to rage over the Great Lakes. They made it across Lake Erie without much trouble, but when they entered the waters of Lake Huron, a storm began to batter the two freighters. The Townsend decided to take shelter of the safety of the St. Clair River. However, the Morrell decided to fight her way through the storm instead. The Daniel J. Morrell would never make it to her destination. She would end up being the third largest shipwreck on the Great Lakes, and there would only be one survivor from her loss. Launched on August 22, 1906, the boat carrier Daniel J. Morrell was the single largest vessel on the Great Lakes. She was built by the West Bay City Shipbuilding Company in what is today Bay City, Michigan, for the Cambria Steamship Company until 1930. She and her sister ship were bought by the Bethlehem Steel Transportation Company. And her sister, the Edward Y. Townsend, was launched a few days earlier on the 18th of August. Over the course of 6 decades, the Morrell and Townsend were icons of the lakes with no major incidents, with one exception. On August 13, 1909, the Morrell collided with the steamer Henry Phipps in a fogbank in Whitefish Bay. Luckily, both vessels survived the collision. Both the Morrell and the Townsend would have very successful careers on the Great Lakes, transporting millions of tons of iron ore across the Great Lakes. However, there was something about the two ships that would eventually lead to the Morrell's demise in 1966. The Morrell was built using brittle steel that would be very sensitive in cold conditions, especially since the steel that the Morrell was made of when she sank was the same steel that built her 60 years prior. With all these factors in mind, the Morrell was on thin ice towards disaster. November 27, 1966. Both the Daniel J. Morrell and Edward Y. Townsend are docked in Buffalo, New York, supposedly being laid up for the season. However, another freighter's engines were not working, so it was up to the Townsend and Morrell to collect the last load of iron ore for the season. On November 28, the two ships set out to Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, to collect their last load of ore. Captain Arthur Crawley of the Morrell was concerned but confident about the weather ahead, although he was anxious about getting the trip over with. The ship passed through the St. Clair River and made it into southern Lake Huron. As they did, the weather began to make a turn. Huge waves lashed over the deck, gale-force winds of up to 60 miles per hour, and swells up to 25 feet began to engulf the massive freighter. The crew of the Townsend radioed Captain McRae that they were turning around to take shelter in the St. Clair River. However, the Morrell's crew decided to battle their way through the storm instead. Soon, the ship's hull plates began to crack, and rivets began to pop. 26-year-old watchman Dennis Hale went down into the bowels of the ship to see if the ballast tanks had any leaks. He reported that the ship always had leaks, even as early as he joined her crew. He informed the captain of the leaks and went to bed. A few hours later, Hale woke up hearing a tremendous bang. He thought it was the anchor hitting the side of the ship, until another bang happened, and books fell off the shelf above his bed. He ran out on deck to investigate. There, he was greeted with his worst fear. The Morrell's hull had been strained so much by the pounding waves and gale-force winds that the ship began to snap apart like a toothpick. The Morrell was sinking. He could hear the ship tearing like a piece of paper. The boilers and engines of the ship remained in place as the ship broke apart. So once the stern was free of the bow, the stern was moving on its own, and it sailed off into the distance. Hale didn't have time to dress once the general alarm system went off. He grabbed a life jacket and a coat with nothing else on except the shorts he'd been sleeping in. He and his crewmates got into a life raft, but the crew couldn't launch the raft due to the fact that the seas were so rough. Just then, as the stern began to pass the bow section, a huge wave washed over the deck and swept the raft off the ship and into the savage waters. All of the men braced for impact as it happened. The stern sailed off into the distance where she would eventually sink a few miles away. There was no time to send a distress signal when the Morrell sank, so for the men in the life raft, their only option was a flare gun on the raft. The raft began to drift across the lake for the next 38 hours, as several of the crew members had died from hypothermia. Teoh woke up the next morning and asked any of the crewmen if they were still alive. Soon, the Morrell was reported missing after she never arrived in Taconite Harbor, and a search was organized. The Coast Guard helicopter located the raft near Harbor Beach, Michigan, in which Hale was on the verge of death, suffering severe hypothermia, frostbite, and even broken bones. He was taken to the closest hospital. Unfortunately, he was able to return home after 2 weeks, although he wouldn't recover for another few months. The description of what Hale saw that night would never leave him alone, but since he was the single survivor of the Morrell sinking, his testimony was crucial to figure out what could have happened. In January of the next year, just a few months after the disaster, pieces of the ship's hull washed ashore. When researchers examined the steel, Hale's claims about the ship's brittle steel were confirmed. And soon enough, the Edward White Townsend was examined and determined to be unfit to sail. She was decommissioned for a few years before being towed to a scrapyard. However, as the ship was being towed across the Atlantic Ocean to be scrapped, the tow cable snapped in a heavy storm, and she sank about 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, not too far from where the Titanic sits on the seafloor today. But fortunately, no lives were lost. Dennis Teoh would soon write an autobiography about his experience on the book titled Shipwrecked, which was published in 2010. He was even featured in the documentary Graveyard of the Great Lakes. In 2015, Hale passed away from cancer at the age of 75. Today, the Morrell sits in about 200 feet of water on the bottom of Lake Huron. She sits upright with the bow and stern section sitting about 5 miles apart from each other. Surprisingly, when the stern section was explored by divers, the clocks had stopped about 3 hours after the bow's clocks, which suggested that the stern could have remained afloat for another 3 hours after the bow sank. The wreck is a playground for the most advanced of divers, and the Morrell sinking shows us that the Great Lakes, most times, are as or more deadly than the world's oceans. No matter how big these ships are, the Great Lakes will always be bigger.